In a quiet Portland neighborhood, a retired psychology professor was about to face the fight of her life. What started as routine gardening took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her son's betrayal. Dr. Margaret Harrison wasn't your typical vulnerable senior citizen. For 30 years, she had analyzed human behavior at Portland State University, known for decoding manipulation. When she encountered worsening memory lapses, she had no idea she was walking into conspiracy. What began as cognitive concerns became a psychological thriller of family betrayal. Margaret proved her PhD in psychology was the ultimate weapon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Harrison's hands moved with practiced precision through the soil of her rose garden, the familiar rhythm of digging and planting usually bringing her the kind of peace she'd treasured since retirement. The morning Portland mist clung to the petals of her prized David Austin roses, each bloom a testament to 3 years of careful cultivation since James's death. She'd named this corner of her backyard James's Corner, though she'd never spoken the name aloud. The fooey trowel slipped from her fingers. She stared at it for a moment, lying among the dark earth and scattered mulch, trying to recall what she'd been doing. The sensation was like reaching for a word on the tip of her tongue, except the word was her own intention. Her own thoughts. "Ridiculous," she murmured, brushing dirt from her knees as she stood. At 58, she was hardly decrepit. Her body remained strong from decades of walking Portland State's sprawling campus, her mind sharp from 30 years of analyzing human behavior and teaching psychology. These little lapses were nothing more than the normal wear of a busy life, finally slowing down. The phone rang from inside the house, its insistent tone cutting through the morning quiet. Margaret wiped her hands on her gardening apron and hurried inside, catching it on the 4th ring. "Margaret? Thank goodness." The voice belonged to Dr. Linda Chen, her former colleague from the psychology department. "I was starting to worry when you didn't show up for the faculty emeritus lunch yesterday." Margaret's blood went cold. The lunch, the quarterly gathering she'd attended religiously for the past 3 years since retirement. She'd marked it on her calendar in her own careful handwriting, had even laid out her favorite navy blazer the night before. "I'm so sorry, Linda. I've been fighting a terrible headache and I must have— Are you all right? You sound a bit scattered." Linda's voice carried the gentle concern of someone trained to listen beneath the surface of words. "This isn't like you, Margaret. Missing appointments, not returning calls." "Not returning calls?" Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. She had no memory of missing any calls from Linda. "I left 3 messages last week about the journal review you agreed to do. The deadline is tomorrow." Margaret sank into the kitchen chair where she'd shared countless morning coffees with James, her mind racing through the past week like someone frantically searching through filing cabinets. There was nothing. No memory of promising a journal review. No recollection of Linda's messages. "Of course," she heard herself say, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. "I've been distracted. Send me the details again. Would you?" After hanging up, Margaret sat in the kitchen stillness, staring at the calendar on the wall. Yesterday's date was circled in red ink, her own handwriting, her own pen. But the lunch appointment wasn't written there. Just an empty square that should have contained the most important social event of her month. She opened her appointment book, the leather-bound planner James had given her for their 25th anniversary. Her handwriting filled the pages, in neat ordered lines, but as she flipped through the recent weeks, gaps appeared. Missing appointments, incomplete thoughts trailing off mid-sentence, phone numbers without names attached. The journal review deadline was written clearly on today's date, but she had no memory of agreeing to it. None at all. Margaret closed the book and walked to the living room, where James's reading chair still held the impression of his body, though she'd long ago stopped leaving his books on the side table. She'd kept the chair because David had said it was too painful to get rid of, but now she wondered if she'd kept it for herself. A physical reminder of the mind that had never failed, never forgotten, never left her questioning her own perceptions. 2 hours later, she found herself sitting in her car in the parking lot of Safeway, her hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. She'd driven here automatically, following the route she'd taken twice weekly for 20 years. But somewhere, between turning onto Burnside and pulling into the lot, the familiar had become foreign. The store looked wrong. The entrance faced a different direction than she remembered. The parking spaces seemed narrower, the pavement a different color. Even the mountains visible beyond the store appeared to have shifted position against the sky. Margaret sat there for 10 minutes, watching other shoppers navigate the lot with easy familiarity, before accepting the truth that clawed at her chest. She was lost in a place she knew as well as her own home. She started the car and drove. Home by a different route, one that took her through neighborhoods she'd never seen before, following street signs like breadcrumbs until familiar landmarks appeared. The whole drive, she kept thinking of her students, how she'd taught them to observe their own cognitive processes, to notice when their perceptions might be compromised by stress, fatigue, or illness. But this felt different. This felt like something was breaking. David arrived unannounced 3 days later, letting himself in with the key she'd given him after James died. Margaret was in the kitchen, staring at a grocery list written in handwriting she didn't recognize, when she heard his voice call out from the entryway. "Mom, you here?" She quickly folded the list and slipped it into her pocket. "In the kitchen, sweetheart." He appeared in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space in a way that always reminded her of James, though David had inherited her darker coloring and sharp features. His expression carried the careful concern of someone who'd been rehearsing a difficult conversation. "Hey." He kissed her cheek, his embrace lasting a moment longer than usual. "How are you feeling?" "I'm fine. Why wouldn't I be fine?" David settled into the chair across from her, his movements deliberate and measured. She recognized the technique. She'd taught it to countless students learning to navigate difficult conversations with clients. Create a non-threatening presence. Make the other person feel safe before delivering difficult news. "Dr. Chen called me, Mom." Margaret's chest tightened. Linda had no right to. "She's worried about you." "Missing appointments? Not returning calls?" "She said you seemed confused when she talked to you." David leaned forward, his voice gentle but insistent. "And Mrs. Rodriguez next door mentioned that you asked her 3 times last week about the garbage pickup schedule." "I did not ask her 3 times." The words came out sharper than Margaret intended, but even as she spoke them, doubt crept in. She had no clear memory of talking to Elena about garbage pickup at all. "When's the last time you saw a doctor, Mom? For a real checkup, I mean." Margaret stood abruptly, moving to the sink to avoid David's penetrating gaze. "I don't need a doctor. I need people to stop treating me like I'm losing my mind." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to acknowledge. "Nobody thinks you're losing your mind," David said quietly. "But these little episodes, they're adding up. Dr. Chen mentioned you forgot about a journal review you'd agreed to do. That's not like you." Margaret turned to face him, studying his expression. There was genuine concern there, but something else too. Something that reminded her of the way he'd looked as a teenager when he wanted something. A new video game. Permission to stay out late. Money for a school trip. A focused intensity that suggested this conversation had a specific destination. "What if something's wrong?" he continued. "What if it's something treatable? Wouldn't you want to know?" She thought of James, who'd put off seeing a doctor about his persistent cough until the lung cancer had already spread. who died still believing that acknowledging illness was somehow a form of surrender. James always said that worry was interest paid on trouble that might never come, she said softly. Dad also said that smart people gather information before making decisions. David reached across the table and took her hand. Let me help you find a good doctor, someone who specializes in these kinds of concerns. Margaret looked down at their joined hands. David's were smooth and soft, the hands of someone who worked with computers rather than soil. James's hands had been weathered and strong, marked by years of turning book pages and writing in margins. She could almost feel them now, the way they'd covered hers during difficult moments, offering comfort without judgment. You think I'm losing my mind, she said. I think you're my mother, and I love you, and I want to make sure you're okay. David's grip tightened slightly. Will you at least consider it? For me? Margaret closed her eyes, remembering a conversation from 3 decades earlier. She'd been pregnant with David, terrified by the responsibility of shaping another human being's mind and heart. James had found her crying in this same kitchen, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what lay ahead. The only way to fail as a parent, he'd told her, is to stop caring enough to try. Now David was trying to care for her, and the role reversal felt like another kind of loss. But as she sat there, holding her son's hand and trying to remember whether she'd really asked Elena about garbage pickup 3 times, Margaret realized that her greatest fear wasn't losing her mind. It was that she might already be losing it. And she was the last to know. All right, she said finally. I'll see a doctor. The relief that flooded David's face was so profound that Margaret wondered what other signs she'd been missing. What other evidence of her declining faculties had he been collecting while she remained blissfully unaware? As they made plans, for her to see someone David knew, a young doctor who was apparently very good with older patients, Margaret tried to push away the growing certainty that she was about to step into something from which there might be no return. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. But sitting in her kitchen, surrounded by the life she'd built with James and the son they'd raised together, Margaret Harrison made the choice to trust the people who loved her more than she trusted her own increasingly unreliable perceptions. It was a decision that would haunt her for months to come. Margaret's hands trembled as she filled out intake forms in the sterile waiting room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with institutional persistence, making her think of places where personal agency had already begun to slip away. David sat beside her, restlessly checking his phone. She noticed his expensive Rolex. When had he gotten that? How could he afford it on his complained-about tech salary? Dr. Walsh will see you now, the receptionist called. A woman in her mid-30s approached, white coat crisp, blonde hair in a professional bun. She was prettier than Margaret expected, with polished appearance suggesting careful attention to image. Mrs. Harrison, I'm Dr. Sarah Walsh. The handshake was firm but brief, clinical rather than warm. David's told me so much about you. Margaret's training kicked in, noting how Sarah's eyes lingered on David rather than maintaining patient focus. And how exactly do you two know each other? We're dating, David said quickly, kissing Sarah's cheek in a gesture that seemed performative. I mentioned Mom's concerns, and Sarah offered to help. The first stirring of unease. 30 years of clinical practice had taught Margaret to trust her instincts, and something felt fundamentally wrong about this arrangement, the casual mixing of personal and professional relationships, Sarah's attention drifting to David during what should be patient-focused interaction. In the examination room, Sarah settled behind her desk with practiced authority that felt rehearsed rather than earned. David tells me you've been experiencing memory issues, Sarah began, fingers already moving across her laptop. Forgetting. Appointments. Getting confused. I've had a few episodes, Margaret said carefully. Nothing outside normal. When did these begin? Sarah interrupted, not looking up. Margaret paused, studying Sarah's profile. The interruption was rude, but the typing bothered her most. Sarah was documenting in real time, typing far more than Margaret had actually said. About 3 weeks ago, though I'm not certain they're as significant as David thinks. More typing. Any disorientation? Getting lost in familiar places? The question hit close to home. Margaret thought of the Safeway parking lot, that terrible confusion in a place she'd visited for decades. Once. But I was tired. Any hallucinations? No. Family history of dementia? The questions came rapid fire, Sarah's fingers dancing across keys with practiced efficiency. But Margaret noticed something troubling. Sarah wasn't really listening. She was working from a predetermined script, documenting responses that seemed decided before Margaret entered. The cognitive tests that followed felt both familiar and wrong. Margaret recognized them from graduate training, memory assessments, clock drawing, word recall. But Sarah administered them with casual indifference, suggesting results mattered, less than appearance of conducting them. "Draw a clock showing 10 past 11, Sarah said. Margaret completed it easily, but Sarah barely glanced before making notes. As the assessment continued, Margaret observed Sarah with analytical attention. The doctor's body language was wrong for genuine evaluation. Posture too relaxed, eye contact intermittent, attention frequently drawn to David sitting silently in the corner. "What we're seeing here," Sarah concluded, "are classic early signs of cognitive decline. Nothing alarming, but definitely something to address proactively." "What exactly are you seeing?" Margaret asked. "You've spent more time typing than listening, and your methodology is questionable." David shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, Dr. Walsh is trying to help." "Is she? I'm curious about your diagnostic criteria. What specific markers determine cognitive decline from a 20-minute interview?" Sarah's cheeks flushed. "I have extensive experience with geriatric patients. I'm 58, hardly geriatric, and you haven't asked about medication history, stress levels, or other factors contributing to temporary symptoms." David's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, anxiety flashing across his features. "Excuse me," he said, standing abruptly. "Work emergency." He stepped into the hallway, leaving Margaret alone with Sarah. The dynamic shifted immediately, Sarah's professional mask slipping to reveal something harder. "Mrs. Harrison," Sarah said quietly, "denial won't help you or your family." "And what will help me, Dr. Walsh?" "I'd like to start you on medication. Donepezil, combined with a mild anxiolytic for agitation." Margaret's blood went cold. Donepezil was for Alzheimer's, serious medication with serious side effects, not prescribed lightly for minor forgetfulness. Adding anti-anxiety medication raised more red flags. That seems aggressive for occasional forgetfulness. Early intervention is key. Sarah was already writing prescriptions. "The sooner we start, the better we manage progression." "Progression of what? You haven't diagnosed anything specific." Sarah looked up, and Margaret saw something chilling: impatience. Not overworked doctor impatience, but impatience of someone whose plans were encountering resistance. "I'm trying to help you maintain independence, but that requires cooperation." The undertone was unmistakable, subtle coercion disguised as medical advice. Margaret recognized it from her studies of manipulation tactics. David returned, slipping, his phone away with practiced casualness, hands shaking slightly. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, and Margaret caught their meaningful look. "Fine, just work." Sarah handed Margaret prescriptions with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Start with one of each, mornings. We'll monitor and adjust." Margaret noted significantly higher doses than expected for mild symptoms. Either Sarah was incompetent or something else was happening. I'd like to research these first. Of course, though I'd recommend starting soon. Early treatment is crucial. In the parking lot, David walked her to the car with performed solicitousness. Sarah seems knowledgeable, he said. You're in good hands. Margaret looked back at the building, where Sarah watched through her office window. The doctor's attention was fixed on David, not her patient, and something about that gaze reminded Margaret of a predator watching prey. How long have you been dating Dr. Walsh? A few months. Why? And it was her idea to take me as a patient? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot. To us. Now back to the story. David's hesitation was barely perceptible. She offered when I mentioned your concerns. She wanted to help. Margaret studied her son's face, noting careful avoidance of eye contact, tension suggesting he was working to control his expression. Every instinct screamed something was fundamentally wrong. That evening, Margaret sat with prescriptions spread before her, trying to decide whether taking them would be self-care or self-destruction. The Portland rain drummed against windows with persistent isolation. She thought of James, who would have known what questions to ask, what red flags to watch for. Now she was alone with suspicions, David's expensive watch, and Dr. Walsh's aggressive treatment plan. Margaret opened the first bottle, staring at small white pills inside. Each one was a decision point between trust and self-preservation, prescribed by a woman more interested in David than her patient's well-being. The choice felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness, with no way of knowing whether solid ground waited below or an endless fall into confusion from which there might be no return. Margaret swallowed the first pill with her morning coffee, the bitter taste lingering despite her familiar breakfast routine. The decision had come at 3 a.m. when sleeplessness and doubt finally wore down her resistance. If she was wrong about Sarah and David, the medication might help. If she was right, at least she'd have evidence. The effects began subtly. By the third day, words slipped away mid-sentence, leaving her grasping for concepts that had been clear moments before. She'd be explaining something to Elena Rodriguez over the garden fence, then find herself staring blankly, the conversation dissolving like smoke. Are you feeling all right, Margaret? Elena asked Thursday morning, her dark eyes filled with concern that cut deeper than casual politeness. Elena had watched her parents decline for 5 years, caring for them with devotion born from understanding. What was at stake? Just tired, Margaret replied, though tired felt wrong. This wasn't fatigue. It was as if someone had turned down the volume on her thoughts. By week's end, Margaret could barely finish reading newspaper articles. Words swam across pages, meaning fragmenting before she could grasp it. She'd always been voracious, working through 3 books simultaneously. But now even grocery circulars seemed incomprehensible. David began calling daily, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone monitoring a situation. How are you feeling? Mom? Any improvement? It's hard to say. Margaret gripped the phone tighter. I think maybe worse. That's normal, David said quickly. Dr. Walsh said there might be an adjustment period. Your brain is learning to work with the medication. Margaret's buried professional training recognized something wrong with that explanation. Cognitive. Medications weren't supposed to make symptoms worse first. They should slow decline, not accelerate it. Elena knocked Tuesday, carrying casserole and wearing the expression of someone who'd made a difficult decision. I'm worried about you, she said without preamble. You seem different, confused in ways you weren't before. Margaret tried focusing on Elena's face, but even that felt overwhelming. The medication. David says it's normal. What? Medication exactly? Elna sat across from her. What are you taking? Margaret retrieved the bottles, movements slow and deliberate. Elena read labels with careful attention of someone who'd navigated healthcare for aging parents. These are very strong, Margaret. Donepezil is for Alzheimer's disease. And this other one? Elena frowned. This is a sedative. Why would you need a sedative? Dr. Walsh said, for agitation. Are you agitated? Margaret tried remembering, feeling agitated, but recent past seemed wrapped in cotton. I don't think so. I'm mostly just lost. Elena leaned forward, voice dropping to urgent whisper. Margaret, listen carefully. My father was on Donepezil for 2 years before he died. These doses you're taking, they're much higher than what he ever had. And he was in advanced dementia. The words penetrated fog like cold water. Margaret forced concentration, drawing on 3 decades of training to focus on Elena's face. Higher doses? What were your symptoms before starting? These really think. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to reach through medicated haze to remember who she'd been 2 weeks ago. Some forgetfulness, yes. The grocery store incident, missing faculty lunch. But she'd been herself, sharp, analytical, capable. I forgot. Some appointments, she said slowly. Got confused once driving. But nothing like this. Elena took her hands. These medications aren't helping you, Margaret. They're making you worse. But David said... What exactly did David say? When? Margaret tried remembering, but conversations blended together in medicated memory. Had David really explained adjustment periods? Or had she imagined that? David's key turned in the lock. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, quickly assessing Margaret's confused state, Elena's protective posture, medication bottles between them. Elena, he said pleasantly, though Margaret caught tension around his eyes. Just checking on Mom. I was asking Margaret about her medication. These seem like very strong doses. David moved to the counter, tidying dishes that didn't need tidying. Dr. Walsh knows what she's doing. Mom's symptoms were getting severe. Were they? Elena looked directly at Margaret. What symptoms exactly? The question hung in air. Margaret tried remembering what she'd told Sarah, but memories felt slippery, unreliable. Mom's been having a hard time, David said when Margaret didn't respond. Haven't you, Mom? Margaret looked between David and Elena, feeling like a child caught between arguing adults. The medication made everything distant, unreal. I should let you talk, Elena said, standing slowly. But she squeezed Margaret's shoulder as she passed. Margaret, you have my number. Call me if you need anything. Anything at all. After Elena left, David settled into her chair with casual possession. You seem better today, he said, though Margaret felt worse than ever. Dr. Walsh thinks it might be helpful if I started managing some of your finances, just temporarily while you adjust. The words penetrated fog like an alarm. Managing her finances? When had they discussed that? I can manage my own money, she said, though she wondered if that was true. She couldn't remember last balancing her checkbook. Of course you can, David said soothingly. It's just that you've been forgetting. You missed your mortgage payment last week. Had she? Margaret tried remembering, but thoughts felt like holding water in cupped hands. I have automatic payments. Not for everything, Mom. Some payments have been irregular. David pulled out his expensive laptop. Let me show you. Numbers on screen might as well have been hieroglyphics. Margaret stared at bank statements. David claimed showed her incompetence, but medication made focusing impossible. I've talked to the bank about a joint account, David continued, just as safety measure. So if something happens, I can make sure everything gets taken care of. Margaret wanted to protest, but words felt too heavy. The medication had turned her mind to thick syrup. I don't know, she managed. Dr. Walsh thinks it's a good idea. She's seen people in your condition who wait too long. Their families end up in terrible situations. That evening, after David left promising to take care of everything, Margaret sat in darkness, staring at medication bottles. Elena's words echoed, "These medications aren't helping you. They're making you worse." But if Elena was right, that meant David was lying. It meant Sarah was poisoning her with unnecessary medications. It meant the two people she trusted most were systematically destroying her mind. The alternative, that she really was losing her faculties, felt easier to accept. At least mental decline happened to people. At least it didn't require believing her son would deliberately harm her. Margaret reached for evening medication, hand shaking with something deeper than pill-induced tremor. She swallowed them and waited for tomorrow's fog, knowing that with each dose, the person she'd been slipped further away, leaving someone vulnerable enough to need the very protection that was destroying her. Margaret woke Thursday morning with unusual clarity, as if someone had adjusted the focus on a blurry photograph. For the first time in weeks, her thoughts moved in straight lines rather than meandering through fog. She lay in bed, savoring mental sharpness she'd almost forgotten existed. The realization struck like cold water. She'd forgotten her evening medication. She sat up slowly, testing her cognitive state like a scientist examining a specimen. Yesterday's newspaper lay on her nightstand. She read 3 paragraphs without words swimming away. The relief was so profound it brought tears. Moving carefully, Margaret retrieved a notebook from her desk. James had always said good research began with systematic observation. If she was going to understand what was happening, she needed documentation. She wrote the date, then began recording. Day 12 of medication. Missed evening dose last night. Significant improvement in cognitive function this morning. The act of writing itself felt miraculous. Her handwriting was steady, thoughts organized. This was the Margaret she remembered being. Elena knocked just after 9, carrying fresh muffins and wearing cautious hope. "You look different this morning," Elena said, studying Margaret's face. "More present." "I feel different." Margaret led her to the kitchen, where sunlight seemed brighter than it had in weeks. "Elena, when you mentioned the medication doses being too high, how did you know?" Elena chose words carefully. "My father was prescribed donepezil when his Alzheimer's was diagnosed. The doctor started him on 5 milligrams daily, only increasing gradually. Even at the end, he was taking 10 milligrams. Margaret retrieved her prescription bottles, reading labels with clear eyes for the first time. "Mine says 20 milligrams. Daily. That's double what my father took in his final year, Margaret. And this other medication." Elena picked up the second bottle. "Lorazepam, 2 milligrams twice daily. This is powerful sedative. My mother took half this dose after her stroke, and it left her barely functional." Pieces began clicking together with terrifying clarity. Margaret's professional training, suppressed for weeks under chemical fog, reasserted itself. She was being systematically drugged into compliance. "Elena, I need your help." Margaret opened her notebook. "I want to track my symptoms against medication schedule, but I need someone else to observe, because I can't trust my own perceptions when medicated." They spent the morning researching Margaret's prescriptions online. Every medical site confirmed Elena's observations. Doses were dangerously high for mild cognitive symptoms. The combination could cause exactly the confusion, memory loss, and disorientation Margaret had experienced. "This is chemical restraint," Margaret said, the clinical term emerging from years studying elder abuse. "Medical manipulation used to control people." Elena's face darkened. But why would Dr. Walsh do this? And why would David allow it? Before Margaret could answer, she heard David's key in the front door. They quickly closed the laptop and tucked away the notebook, but not before Margaret memorized crucial information. Her medications were designed to incapacitate, not heal. "Morning, Mom?" David appeared in the kitchen, his expensive watch catching light. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Margaret said carefully, testing how much clarity she could reveal without raising suspicion. "That's great. Dr. Walsh said you might have good days." He moved to the counter where Margaret kept her pill organizer. "Did you take your morning medication?" "Not yet." "You should take it with breakfast. Consistency is important." David retrieved bottles, shaking out pills with practiced efficiency. Margaret watched him prepare her chemical prison, noting his familiarity with the routine. This wasn't casual assistance. This was systematic administration. "David," Elena said suddenly, "how did you and Dr. Walsh meet?" David's hand paused almost imperceptibly. "Through friends. Why?" "It seems convenient she could take Margaret as patient so quickly. Most doctors have waiting lists." "She wanted to help." David's voice carried slight edge. "She has experience with these kinds of situations." Margaret caught the careful phrasing, how David avoided specific medical terminology. She accepted pills from him, palming them while pretending to swallow. The deception felt like small victory. After David left, promising to return later to help with paperwork, Margaret spat pills into tissue and showed Elena. "I'm going to stop taking them," Margaret announced. "All of them." "That could be dangerous if you stop suddenly," Elena warned. "Some medications require gradual tapering." "Then I'll reduce gradually. But I need my mind back, Elena. I need to think clearly enough to figure out what David and Sarah are really doing." They researched medication withdrawal, creating a plan to reduce doses slowly while monitoring symptoms. Elena agreed to check daily, providing external observation Margaret needed to distinguish withdrawal effects from returning clarity. That afternoon, Margaret took only half her usual doses. By evening, fog lifted further. She spent an hour reviewing financial records, finding irregularities she'd been too confused to notice. Payments had been made from her accounts that she didn't remember authorizing. Bank statements showed unfamiliar patterns. The most chilling discovery came when she checked recent phone calls. According to her phone's history, she'd had multiple conversations with David over the past 2 weeks. Conversations she had no memory of having. Either her memory was far worse than realized, or those calls never happened. Margaret opened her notebook and began documenting everything. Unauthorized payments, mysterious phone calls, suspicious timing of David's increased involvement coinciding with her relationship with Sarah. A pattern emerged that made her blood run cold. David had been positioning himself as her caretaker, creating evidence of her incompetence while she was too medicated to resist or remember. The joint bank account wasn't safety measure, it was takeover. That night, as Margaret lay in bed with her clearest thoughts in weeks, she faced terrifying truth. Her own son was systematically destroying her mind and stealing her independence. The question was why? She thought about David's expensive watch, his sudden access to a doctor willing to prescribe inappropriate medications, his urgent need to manage her finances. The answer felt obvious, even though accepting it meant acknowledging that the child she'd raised was capable of such calculated cruelty. Margaret reached for her notebook and wrote one final entry. "David is in financial trouble. Sarah is helping him gain control of my assets by making me appear incompetent. The medication is the weapon. My clarity is the evidence. Tomorrow, she would continue reducing doses. Tomorrow, she would begin fighting back. But tonight, she allowed herself to grieve for the son she thought she knew, and the trust she could never fully recover. The fog of medication had hidden many things, but now, as her mind cleared, Margaret saw truth with devastating clarity. Sometimes the people who claim to protect you are the ones you most need protection from." By the end of her first week of reduced medication, Margaret's mind had sharpened to painful clarity after weeks of chemical fog. She sat at her kitchen table at dawn, surrounded by bank statements, legal documents, and her growing notebook of evidence feeling like an archaeologist uncovering ruins of her own life. Elena arrived with coffee and grim determination. "What did you find?" Elena asked, settling into her unofficial post. "More than I wanted to." Margaret spread bank statements across the table. "Look at this pattern. Every time I had what David called a bad episode, there was unusual activity in my accounts the next day." Elena leaned over the papers, her history professor training evident in how she organized documents chronologically. "These withdrawals, some are for thousands of dollars. All authorized with my debit card and PIN. Either I was making these transactions while completely confused, or—" Margaret let the implication hang. "Or David has your PIN and was making withdrawals while you were too medicated to remember." Margaret pointed to specific dates. "Here's the grocery store incident where I got lost. The next day, $5,000 transferred to an account I don't recognize. Here's when I missed faculty lunch. Another $3,000 gone." Elena studied the pattern with growing alarm. "This looks like systematic financial abuse, but David would need more than your PIN. He'd need access to online banking, account information." "Which I gave him." Margaret's voice was flat with self-recrimination. "When he said I was forgetting bills, I gave him my passwords so he could help. I was so confused, so grateful for assistance." They worked in silence, Margaret cross-referencing her medication schedule with financial irregularities. The correlation was perfect. Every increase in doses corresponded with increased financial activity she couldn't remember authorizing. "There's something else," Margaret said quietly. "David's gambling problem is worse than I suspected." She showed Elena printouts found in David's jacket pocket, betting slips, casino cards, emails from creditors demanding payment. The amounts were staggering, tens of thousands in debt. "These debts are recent," Elena said, studying papers. "Most from the past 6 months, right around when he started dating Sarah." Margaret pulled out her phone. "Elena, I need to show you something. Else, but promise you won't think I'm paranoid." She opened her call log, scrolling to conversations with David she had no memory of having. According to this, David and I had a 30-minute conversation last Tuesday. I was supposedly discussing symptoms, asking him to find a better doctor. But you don't remember it. I don't remember because I don't think it happened. I think David's been creating fake call logs, maybe using my phone to call himself and record one-sided conversations. Margaret's voice shook. "Evidence that I was reaching out, confused and asking for help." Elena stared at the phone. "That's incredibly sophisticated manipulation." "It gets worse." Margaret opened her laptop, which she'd finally been able to use clearly. "I've been going through David's social media, his email account still logged in from when he helped me set up my computer." What she'd found made her stomach turn. Messages between David and Sarah going back months, discussing Margaret's condition and their strategy for managing it. The tone was clinical, calculating, like researchers discussing a lab specimen. "Look at this." Margaret pointed to a message from Sarah to David, dated 3 weeks before Margaret's first appointment. She's asking about Margaret's baseline, cognitive function, and whether she has experience with psychiatric medications. Elena read over Margaret's shoulder, face growing pale. "They were planning this before you even showed symptoms." The symptoms were never real. Or they were minimal, normal aging they decided to exploit. Sarah started me on medications that would create the confusion they needed to justify taking control. The most damaging evidence was in David's messages to someone identified only as M, apparently a lawyer about guardianship proceedings. "I've been building the case gradually," David had written. "Medical documentation of cognitive decline, evidence of financial mismanagement, testimony from healthcare providers. Should be able to move forward within the next month." Margaret, read the message 3 times, each reading making the betrayal feel more complete. Her son hadn't just been stealing, he'd been systematically building a legal case to have her declared incompetent. "Margaret," Elena said carefully, "we need to think about your safety. If David realizes you're getting better, if he knows you're onto him, he'll increase the medication, or find another way to incapacitate me." Margaret closed the laptop, feeling simultaneously clear-headed and terrified. "I think I'm in real danger." They spent the morning developing a plan. Elena would help document everything, creating copies of evidence stored safely away from the house. Margaret would continue reducing medication while pretending to remain confused around David. "We need professional help," Elena said. "Police, lawyers, someone with authority." "With what evidence?" "David will say I'm paranoid, confused from my condition. Sarah will provide medical testimony that I'm incompetent. It's the perfect crime. They're using my supposed mental illness to discredit any accusations." The cruelest irony wasn't lost on Margaret. The clarity that allowed her to see the conspiracy also made her appear more paranoid to outside observers. The more coherent her accusations, the more they'd sound like delusions. That afternoon, David arrived for his usual check-in, bringing flowers and solicitous concern Margaret now recognized as performance. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" he asked, arranging flowers with unnecessary fuss. "Confused," Margaret lied, forcing uncertainty into her voice. "I keep losing track of things." "That's okay. Dr. Walsh said we might need to adjust medications. Maybe increase doses if you're not responding as hoped." The casual way he discussed increasing her chemical restraints made Margaret's skin crawl, but she nodded helplessly. "Whatever you think is best." "I've been thinking it might be time to look into assisted living options, just in case your condition continues worsening." "Assisted living?" Margaret made her voice small, frightened. "Nothing permanent, just a safety net. Somewhere with medical staff to monitor medications, make sure you're eating properly, keep you safe." Margaret realized with horrible clarity this was the endgame. Isolate her in a facility where her access to the outside world could be controlled, where any protests would be dismissed as symptoms. After David left, Margaret sat shaking with rage and fear. She thought of all the elderly people who'd experienced similar betrayals, systematically stripped of agency by people they trusted most. How many were sitting in facilities now, labeled as demented when they were actually abuse victims? That night, Margaret made two decisions that would change everything. First, she would stop taking medications entirely, accepting withdrawal risk for complete mental clarity. Second, she would contact Detective Ray Morrison, whose name Elena had found in a newspaper article about elder abuse investigations. Margaret opened her notebook and wrote, "Day 7 of reduced medication. Mental clarity fully returned. Evidence of systematic financial exploitation and medical manipulation documented. David planning guardianship proceedings and institutional placement. Time to fight back." She closed the notebook and walked to her bedroom window, looking out at the Portland neighborhood she'd called home for 30 years. Tomorrow she would take the first step in what might be her final battle for independence. Margaret thought of James, who'd always said courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was action in spite of it. She was terrified of what lay ahead, but more terrified of the alternative. Spending remaining years as a prisoner in her own life, chemically controlled and legally powerless. The fog had lifted. Now came the fight. Margaret spent 3 days preparing for the confrontation, her mind sharp as surgical steel now that she'd been completely off medication for 72 hours. She arranged evidence meticulously across her dining room table: bank statements, printed emails, David's gambling debts, medication bottles with dangerously high doses. Elena had helped create copies, storing them safely at her house. When David arrived for his Thursday check-in, Margaret was ready. "Mom, how are you feeling?" David asked, hanging his expensive coat on a chair. The Rolex caught the light, and Margaret wondered how she'd missed such an obvious sign of desperation. "Sit down, David." Margaret's voice carried authority she hadn't used in weeks. "We need to talk." Something in her tone made David pause. His practiced smile faltered as he took in her clear eyes, steady posture. The evidence spread between them. "What's all this?" he asked, but Margaret caught the flicker of recognition and fear. "This is documentation of what you and Sarah have been doing to me." David's face went through rapid expressions, confusion, concern, then careful blankness. Margaret recognized the sequence from years studying deception. He was calculating which mask to wear. "Mom, I don't understand. Are you feeling confused again? Maybe we should call Dr. Walsh." "Don't." Margaret's voice cut through his performance, like a blade. "Don't you dare try to gaslight me again. I know exactly what you've been doing, David. The question is whether you're going to admit it or continue lying." David remained standing, hands moving restlessly to his watch, phone, collar. Classic displacement behaviors Margaret had observed in countless anxious patients. "I think you should sit down and take your medication," David said, gaining an edge of authority. "You're clearly having an episode." "I haven't taken that poison in 3 days," Margaret said quietly. "Funny how my episode stopped the moment I stopped taking the drugs you and your girlfriend have been using to control me." The word poison hit David like a physical blow. He stepped back, careful composure cracking. "Mom, those medications are helping you," Dr. Walsh explained. Dr. Walsh explained nothing. Margaret picked up a printout of Sarah's messages. "But she did write very interesting emails about my baseline cognitive function and how best to manage my decline." Decline that didn't exist until she started medicating me. David's face went pale. "Where did you get those?" "From your email account, the one you left logged in when you were helping me manage my affairs." Margaret's voice dripped contempt. "Did you think I'd stay confused forever? Did you think I'd never figure out my own son was systematically poisoning me?" "It's not like that," David started, but Margaret cut him off. "Then what is it like? Explain how stealing $43,000 while I was chemically incapacitated is helping me. Explain how forging call logs to create evidence of my incompetence is for my own good." David sank into the chair, hands shaking. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under? Gambling debts." Margaret slid casino receipts across the table. $68,000 you owe to people who don't accept late payments. Is that the pressure?" "It got out of hand," David said, voice barely above a whisper. "I was trying to win it back, but it kept getting worse. And then Sarah said..." "Sarah said what? That you could solve your problems by stealing from your mother? That you could have me declared incompetent and take control of my assets?" David's silence was answer. "Enough." Margaret leaned forward, studying her son's face with clinical detachment. "How long have you been planning this? When did you decide that drugging your own mother was acceptable?" "I never wanted to hurt you," David said, tears forming. "Sarah said the medications would just make you a little confused, easier to care for. She said it was better than watching you decline naturally." "Safe?" Margaret's voice rose with first real anger. "You call systematic financial abuse and chemical restraint keeping me safe? You were planning to have me committed, David. Locked away where I couldn't interfere with your theft." David wiped his eyes. For a moment, Margaret saw the little boy he'd once been, the child she'd raised with love, who'd never shown signs of such cruelty. "The people I owe money to aren't patient," David said quietly. "They were going to hurt me, Mom. Maybe kill me. So you decided to destroy me instead. I thought if I could get enough money to pay them off, I could put everything back. Pay you back, get you off medications. Pretend none of this happened." Margaret stared at her son, seeing clearly the delusion that had allowed him to justify his actions. "And the guardianship proceedings?" The assisted living facility you've been researching? David's face crumpled. I panicked. When you started asking questions, getting suspicious, Sarah said we needed to move faster. She said if we could get you committed, we'd have time to figure everything out. I'll figure out how to steal the rest of my money. I was going to take care of you, David insisted desperately. Even in the facility, I would have made sure you were comfortable. While I was chemically sedated and legally powerless, David looked around the room, the home where he'd grown up, the life his parents had built, the trust he'd systematically betrayed. I know how this looks, he said finally. But I love you, Mom. You wanted my money more than my well-being, Margaret said. You wanted a solution to your problems more than my dignity. That's not love, David. That's exploitation. David's phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at it and went white. Sarah? She's wondering why I haven't brought you in for your medication adjustment appointment. The one where she was going to increase my doses to make me even more compliant? David nodded miserably. Margaret reached for her phone. I'm calling the police. Wait, please! David lunged forward, grabbing her wrist. If you report this, I'm going to prison. The people I owe money to will kill me. Margaret looked down at her son's hand on her wrist, the first time he'd physically restrained her, and felt the last of her parental protectiveness crumble. Let go of me, she said quietly. Mom, please, I can fix this. Let go of me. David released her wrist as if burned. Margaret rubbed the spot where his fingers had gripped her, seeing faint marks. That's the first time you've ever put your hands on me in anger, she said. How long before it would have been the Kai? Last time? I would never hurt you. You've been hurting me for weeks, David. What you just did was simply more honest about it. Margaret picked up her phone again, but David's voice stopped her. What about Dad? He always believed in second chances. He always said family was the most important thing. The words hit like a physical blow. Margaret closed her eyes, remembering James's gentle nature, his faith in redemption. But she also remembered his unwavering sense of justice. Your father would be heartbroken to see what you've become, but he would also want me to protect myself from you. She dialed 911. This is Dr. Margaret Harrison. I need to report elder abuse and financial exploitation by a family member. David sat watching his world collapse with slow-motion inevitability. When Margaret finished with the dispatcher, she looked at her son for what might be the last time. I raised you to be better than this, she said quietly. I don't know where I went wrong, but I won't enable you to hurt me anymore. Mom, I'm sorry. I know you are. But sorry doesn't give me back the weeks you stole. Sorry doesn't undo the terror. Sorry doesn't rebuild the trust you destroyed. In the distance, sirens approached. Margaret sat surrounded by evidence of her son's betrayal, feeling something she hadn't experienced in weeks, complete clarity about what needed to happen next. The hardest battles were often fought against people you loved, but sometimes choosing yourself over someone else's destructive need was the most loving thing you could do for both of you. Detective Ray Morrison arrived at Margaret's house 40 minutes after her call, accompanied by a uniformed officer and a social worker from Adult Protective Services. Margaret had used the time to organize her evidence more systematically, drawing on decades of academic experience to present her case clearly and persuasively. Morrison was a tall man in his early 50s with graying temples and the kind of steady presence that suggested he'd seen everything before. Margaret noticed how his eyes immediately went to David, who sat slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon, then swept the room, taking in the spread of documents with professional assessment. Dr. Harrison? Morrison's voice carried both authority and compassion. I'm Detective Morrison. This is Officer Chen and Ms. Williams from APS. Can you walk us through what's been happening? Margaret had prepared for this moment, knowing that her credibility would depend on presenting facts clearly and without emotional embellishment. 3 weeks ago, I began experiencing what appeared to be cognitive decline. Memory lapses, confusion, disorientation. My son David arranged for me to see Dr. Sarah Walsh, who prescribed high-dose cognitive medications. My symptoms worsened dramatically while on these drugs. She gestured to the evidence spread across her dining room table. 4 days ago, when I accidentally missed my evening medication, I experienced significant mental clarity. That's when I began investigating what had been done to me. Morrison moved to examine the documents while the social worker sat across from Margaret with practiced gentleness. David remained silent, occasionally glancing toward the door as if calculating escape routes. "These medication dosages," Morrison said, studying the prescription bottles, "they seem high for someone with mild symptoms. 20 milligrams of donepezil daily, plus 2 milligrams of lorazepam twice daily," Margaret confirmed. "According to my research, that's double the recommended starting dose for donepezil and quadruple the typical dose for the sedative." Officer Chen had been quietly documenting the scene with her camera, photographing the evidence from multiple angles. "Ma'am, do you have any medical background that would help you evaluate these medications?" "I'm a retired psychology professor. I spent 30 years studying human behavior, including the effects of psychiatric medications on cognitive function. What was done to me is called chemical restraint, the use of medication to control behavior rather than treat illness." Ms. Williams, the social worker, leaned forward with concern. "Dr. Harrison, have you been taking these medications as prescribed until recently?" "Yes, because I trusted my son and Dr. Walsh. The medications made me so confused that I couldn't think clearly enough to question what was happening to me. That was the point." Morrison had moved on to examining the bank statements. "These financial records show significant unusual activity during the period you were medicated. $43,000 in unauthorized withdrawals and transfers," Margaret said, "all made using my debit card and PIN, which I had given to David to help me manage my finances when I became too confused to handle them myself." "Mr. Harrison?" Morrison addressed David directly for the first time. "These are serious allegations. Do you want to respond to them?" David looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "I need a lawyer." "That's your right," Morrison said calmly. "But, Dr. Harrison, I'd like to understand the timeline better. When did your symptoms first appear, and when did the financial irregularities begin?" Margaret walked them through the chronology she'd documented, pointing out the correlation between her bad episodes and subsequent financial activity. "Every time I had what David called a confused day, there would be significant account activity the next day that I had no memory of authorizing." Ms. Williams was taking detailed notes. "Dr. Harrison, do you have copies of all this documentation stored somewhere safe?" "My neighbor Elena Rodriguez has copies of everything. I was concerned that if David realized I was investigating, he might try to destroy the evidence." Morrison's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and frowned. "Dr. Harrison, we're going to need to speak with Dr. Walsh as well. Do you have her contact information?" Margaret provided Sarah's information, then added, "Detective, there's something else you should know. According to emails I found, David has been consulting with a lawyer about having me declared incompetent. He was planning guardianship proceedings." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Ms. Williams's pen moving across her notepad. Morrison studied David with new intensity. "Mr. Harrison, I'm going to need you to come down to the station to answer some questions. This is not an arrest, but given the nature of these allegations, we need to conduct a formal interview." David finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "What about the people I owe money to? If this gets out, if I can't pay them?" "That's not our immediate concern," Morrison said firmly. "Right now, we're focused on the allegations of elder abuse and financial exploitation." Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions watching her son being led toward what might be criminal, charges. Part of her, the mother who had raised him, loved him, sacrificed for him, wanted to call everything back, to find some way to protect him from the consequences of his actions. But the larger part of her, the professional, the rational adult, the woman who had been systematically victimized, knew that accountability was the only path forward. "Dr. Harrison," Morrison said, turning back to her, "I'm going to recommend that you consult with an attorney who specializes in elder law. You're going to need legal representation for both the criminal case and to protect your financial interests." Ms. Williams handed Margaret a business card. "I'm also going to recommend some resources for victims of elder abuse. This kind of betrayal by family members can be particularly traumatic." "I've already identified an attorney," Margaret said. "Patricia Blackwood. She specializes in cases like this." "Good choice," Morrison nodded. "Dr. Blackwood has a strong reputation." "Dr. Harrison, I have to ask, are you currently safe? Do you feel David poses any immediate threat to you?" Margaret thought about the moment David had grabbed her wrist, the desperation in his eyes, the way he'd talked about the people he owed money to. "I don't think he would physically hurt me, but I'm concerned about what he might do if he feels cornered." "We can arrange for a protective order if you'd like," Morrison offered. "And we'll be monitoring the situation closely." After the police and social worker left with David in tow, Margaret sat alone in her dining room surrounded by the evidence of her son's betrayal. The house felt different, not just quieter, but somehow larger, as if removing David's presence had opened up space she hadn't realized was being compressed. Elena appeared at her back door within minutes, having watched the police cars from her kitchen window. "How are you holding up?" Elena asked, settling into the chair David had vacated. "I feel like I've been hollowed out," Margaret admitted, relieved and devastated at the same time. "You did the right thing." "I know I did, but that doesn't make it hurt less." Margaret looked around the room where she'd raised David, where James had helped him with homework, where they'd celebrated birthdays and holidays, and all the ordinary moments that make up a family life. "I keep thinking about where I went wrong, what I missed that could have prevented this." "You didn't cause David's gambling addiction," Elena said firmly. "You didn't make him choose to solve his problems by victimizing you. Those were his choices, Margaret." "I know that intellectually. Emotionally." Margaret shrugged. "I suppose I'll need time to separate what I know from what I feel." That evening, Margaret called attorney Patricia Blackwood and scheduled an appointment for the following morning. She also called Dr. Linda Chen, her former colleague, to explain what had happened, and to ask for help finding a legitimate physician to oversee her recovery from the inappropriate medications. As she prepared for bed in a house that felt both emptier and safer than it had in weeks, Margaret reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. 3 weeks ago, she had been a confident, independent woman enjoying her retirement. Then she had become confused, dependent, vulnerable, a victim of the very person she trusted most. Now she was something else entirely, a survivor who had fought back, who had chosen her own safety over her son's convenience, who had used her professional knowledge and personal strength to reclaim her life. It wasn't the story she would have chosen, but it was her story. And for the first time in weeks, she was the one writing it. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and legal proceedings, medical evaluations, and financial recovery efforts. But tonight, Margaret Harrison went to sleep with a clear mind and the knowledge that she had saved herself. Sometimes, she reflected, that had to be enough. Attorney Patricia Blackwood's office occupied the top floor of a downtown Portland building, with windows overlooking the Willamette River. Margaret arrived early for their Friday appointment, her evidence portfolio organized with academic precision. Patricia was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and sharp intelligence that reminded Margaret of her former colleagues. She reviewed Margaret's documentation with focused attention of someone who had seen similar cases. "This is one of the most systematic examples of medical manipulation I've encountered," Patricia said after an hour of examination. The coordination between your son and Dr. Walsh, the inappropriate dosages, the financial exploitation timed to your confusion, it's sophisticated abuse. Detective Morrison mentioned you've handled cases like this before. Too many, Patricia said grimly. But what makes your case unusual is the medical professional's involvement. Most financial abuse involves family members acting alone. Patricia opened her laptop and began taking notes. Were you Dr. Walsh's only elderly patient, or did you observe others during visits? Margaret thought back to the Northwest Family Health Center. There were other older patients in the waiting room. I remember thinking she seemed to have many elderly clients for such a young doctor. That's significant. We need to investigate whether you were her only victim or part of a broader pattern. Patricia leaned forward. I'm recommending we contact the Oregon Medical Board immediately. What will that accomplish? If we can demonstrate a pattern with multiple patients, it strengthens your case and protects other potential victims. But I should warn you, Dr. Walsh will likely try to discredit you by claiming you were genuinely confused and making false accusations. Margaret had anticipated this. That's why I documented everything so carefully. My symptom journal, the correlation between medication and confusion, the financial evidence, it all supports my competence. Patricia smiled approvingly. Exactly. Your professional background is crucial here. A retired psychology professor doesn't accidentally fabricate complex conspiracy theories. They were interrupted by Patricia's assistant, who entered apologetically. I'm sorry to interrupt, but Detective Morrison is on line 1. He says it's urgent regarding the Harrison case. Patricia picked up the phone, putting it on speaker with Margaret's permission. Patricia, we've got developments on the Walsh investigation. Morrison's voice filled the office. Dr. Walsh showed up at the station this morning claiming Margaret Harrison is having a psychotic break and making delusional accusations. Margaret felt her stomach drop. This was expected, but hearing it still felt like a blow. What exactly did she say? Patricia asked. That Mrs. Harrison has been deteriorating rapidly, that she's non-compliant with medication, and that her accusations are symptoms of declining mental state. Walsh is demanding we bring Margaret in for mental health evaluation. On what authority? Patricia's voice sharpened. That's what I told her. She doesn't have legal standing to demand evaluation, but she's making noise about her medical expertise and concern for her patient's well-being. Margaret leaned toward the phone. Detective Morrison, this is Margaret. Did Dr. Walsh explain why she prescribed such high doses for my mild symptoms? Funny you should ask. When I pressed her on that, she got defensive. Said she was following standard protocols for someone with your presentation. But when I asked for medical records supporting that presentation, she claimed she needed to review them first. Patricia and Margaret exchanged glances. Detective, we need to move quickly on the medical board complaint. If Dr. Walsh is trying to discredit Margaret, she may also be covering her tracks. Agreed. I've also got interesting information about Dr. Walsh's practice. She's had several complaints filed in the past 6 months. Nothing formal yet, but the medical board has been getting calls from family members concerned about elderly relatives who became suddenly confused after starting treatment with Walsh. Margaret felt recognition mixed with validation. How many complaints? At least 4 that I know of. I'm working with the medical board investigator to identify other potential victims. Patricia was making notes. Detective, can you get us contact information for those families? Margaret's case might be stronger if we can show a pattern. After Morrison hung up, Margaret and Patricia spent another hour developing strategy. They would file a formal medical board complaint that afternoon, provide evidence for the criminal investigation, and begin civil proceedings to recover Margaret's stolen money. That afternoon, Margaret and Patricia visited the Oregon Medical Board offices, where they met with investigator Janet Cooper, a former nurse specializing in professional misconduct cases. Dr. Walsh's prescribing patterns have been on our radar, Cooper admitted after reviewing Margaret's evidence. But we haven't had enough concrete evidence to open formal investigation. Your documentation changes that. Cooper showed them a map with pins marking complaint locations. The pattern was clear. Elderly patients throughout Portland metro area, all reporting similar symptoms after beginning treatment with Sarah. We estimate she may have inappropriately medicated as many as 15 elderly patients over the past 8 months, Cooper said. If your case goes to trial, we'll likely have multiple victims testifying about similar experiences. Margaret felt simultaneously vindicated and horrified. 15 people, at least? Dr. Walsh appears to have targeted patients with mild cognitive concerns or worried family members. She prescribed powerful medications that created the very symptoms families were concerned about. But why? Margaret asked. Cooper and Patricia exchanged glances. We think she was building a specialized practice in incompetency evaluations, Cooper explained. Elderly patients declared mentally incompetent generate significant ongoing fees, guardianship evaluations, medication monitoring, family consultations. It's unfortunately lucrative. And David provided her with the perfect test case, Patricia added. A patient with minor concerns, no close family oversight, and significant financial assets. As they left the medical board offices, Margaret felt the weight of representing not just herself, but potentially dozens of other victims. Patricia, Margaret said as they walked to their cars, do you think I would have figured this out if I hadn't been a psychologist? And Patricia considered carefully. Honestly, probably not. Most victims don't have your analytical training or knowledge of psychiatric medications. That's what makes it so insidious. Then how many people are sitting in care facilities right now, chemically sedated and legally powerless, because no one recognized what was being done? Too many, Patricia said quietly. But that's why your case is so important, Margaret. Every successful prosecution makes it harder for people like Dr. Walsh and your son to victimize others. That evening, Margaret sat in her garden where this nightmare had begun 3 weeks ago. The roses James had loved were blooming in full. Summer glory. And Margaret found herself thinking about cycles of growth and decay, about the difference between natural aging and artificial manipulation. Her phone rang. Elena's name appeared. Margaret, are you watching the news? Margaret hurried inside and turned on television. A local reporter stood outside the Northwest Family Health Center, discussing an ongoing investigation into allegations of medical misconduct involving elderly patients. Dr. Sarah Walsh could not be reached for comment, the reporter said. But sources suggest multiple patients and families have come forward with concerns about inappropriate prescribing practices. Margaret watched in fascination as her private nightmare became public news. Tomorrow, the whole community would know what had been done to her. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Dr. Walsh. We need to talk. What you're doing is going to hurt a lot of people, including yourself. Margaret stared at the message, then forwarded it to Detective Morrison and Attorney Blackwood. Sarah's intimidation attempt only confirmed what Margaret already knew. They were on the right track. She deleted the message without responding. She had nothing to say to the woman who had stolen weeks of her life and nearly succeeded in stealing her future. The fight was far from over, but Margaret Harrison was no longer fighting alone. The Multnomah County Courthouse felt like a cathedral of justice as Margaret walked through its doors on a gray October morning, 6 weeks after her confrontation with David. She wore her navy blazer, the same one she'd laid out for the faculty, lunch she'd missed during her darkest medicated days, and carried herself with reclaimed dignity. Patricia Blackwood met her in the lobby, along with Detective Morrison and 3 other families whose elderly relatives had been victimized by Dr. Sarah Walsh. Margaret recognized the mixture of anger and grief in their faces, emotions she'd carried since discovering the conspiracy against her. Are you ready for this? Patricia asked as they approached the courtroom. Margaret nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. Today, David would be sentenced after accepting a plea bargain for elder abuse and financial exploitation. Sarah faced separate criminal charges and had already lost her medical license after the Oregon Medical Board revealed misconduct involving 17 elderly patients. The courtroom was smaller than Margaret expected, but weighty with consequence. David sat at the defendant's table with his court-appointed attorney, wearing a suit Margaret didn't recognize. He'd lost weight during weeks in custody, and his expensive watch was gone, seized as evidence. Judge Susan Chen called court to order with brisk efficiency. Margaret had been surprised to learn the judge was Officer Chen's mother, creating an odd connection that somehow felt appropriate. "Mr. Harrison," Judge Chen addressed David directly, "you've entered a guilty plea to charges of elder abuse, financial exploitation, and conspiracy. Before I impose sentence, do you wish to make a statement?" David stood slowly, hands shaking as he gripped a piece of paper. For a moment, Margaret saw the little boy she'd raised, and her heart clenched with familiar pain. "Your Honor," David began, voice barely audible, "I want to apologize to my mother and to the court for my actions. There's no excuse for what I did. I was desperate because of gambling debts, but that doesn't justify poisoning my own mother or stealing from her." Margaret watched her son struggle with words that felt both genuine and inadequate. "I convinced myself I was protecting her," David continued, "but I was really protecting myself. I destroyed the trust of the person who loved me most, and I'll have to live with that forever." He looked directly at Margaret for the first time since entering the courtroom. "Mom, I know sorry isn't enough, but getting caught was the best thing that could have happened. I'm getting help for my gambling addiction, and I'm going to spend however long it takes making this right." Judge Chen studied David with measured assessment. "Mr. Harrison, your crimes represent particularly egregious abuse, systematic exploitation of a vulnerable adult by someone in a position of trust. The fact that the victim was your own mother makes this especially troubling." Margaret felt the courtroom's attention focus on her as Judge Chen continued. "However, I've reviewed Dr. Harrison's victim impact statement, and I note her request for rehabilitation over punishment. I've also considered your cooperation with law enforcement in investigating Dr. Walsh's broader misconduct." The judge paused, consulting her notes. "I'm sentencing you to 18 months in county jail, with possibility of work release after 6 months contingent on continued participation in gambling addiction treatment. You'll also serve 3 years supervised probation and pay full restitution to your mother in the amount of $43,000. Margaret felt complex emotions. Relief David wouldn't face the maximum 5-year sentence, grief that it had come to this, satisfaction that justice was being served. "Additionally," Judge Chen continued, "you're prohibited from having financial authority over any elderly person, and you must complete 200 hours of community service at elder care facilities. Perhaps serving the population you victimized will help you understand the full impact of your actions." After David was led away, Margaret stepped outside the courthouse with Patricia and Detective Morrison. The gray Portland sky seemed brighter, as if a weight she'd been carrying had finally lifted. "How do you feel?" Patricia asked. "Lighter," Margaret said, surprised by the truth. "And sad, but mostly relieved it's over." "It's not quite over," Detective Morrison said gently. "Dr. Walsh's trial is scheduled for next month. You'll need to testify about your experience." Margaret nodded. She'd been preparing for that testimony, viewing it as her opportunity to speak for all of Sarah's victims, especially those who hadn't been as fortunate in recognizing and escaping the manipulation. 3 months later, Margaret sat in her garden, the same spot where she'd first noticed memory lapses that started this nightmare. But now she was there by choice, tending James's roses with hands that no longer shook from unwanted medication. Elena joined her, as she had most afternoons since the legal proceedings concluded. Their friendship had deepened through the crisis, evolving from neighborly concern to chosen family. "Any word from David?" Elena asked, settling into the garden chair they'd added for her visits. He writes once a week, Margaret said, not looking up from her pruning. He's working in the jail's kitchen and attending AA meetings twice weekly. He seems different, more honest with himself. Do you think you'll have a relationship with him when he gets out? Margaret considered the question weighing on her mind. A different kind of relationship, maybe. I'll always love him, but I can't trust him like I used to. That's something we'll both have to live with. She'd been seeing a therapist specializing in family trauma, working through complex emotions of loving someone who had betrayed her so completely. The therapy helped her understand that forgiveness didn't require returning to how things were before. I've been thinking about James lately, Margaret continued, about what he would think of how this turned out. What do you think he'd say? He'd be proud I fought back, but he'd also be heartbroken about David. Margaret smiled sadly. He always believed people could change, given the right circumstances. Maybe David's circumstances are finally right. For change. That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table writing her weekly letter to David. She told him about the roses blooming, about Elena's research project, about the support group she'd started for families affected by elder abuse. She didn't tell him she loved him. That felt too easy, too much like the enabling she'd been guilty of before. Instead, she told him she hoped he was learning to love himself enough to make better choices. Margaret sealed the letter with others she'd written, but never sent. Someday, she might give them to him. But for now, writing them was enough, a way of working through her healing while maintaining necessary boundaries. Outside, Portland settled into evening quiet, and Margaret Harrison settled into a life that was smaller than before, no longer centered around David's needs, but infinitely more her own. The fog had lifted permanently. What remained was clarity, hard-won and fiercely protected. 6 months after Dr. Sarah Walsh received a 3-year prison sentence for medical fraud and elder abuse, Margaret Harrison stood before a room of 25 family members whose loved ones had been victims of similar schemes. The monthly support group met in the community room of the Multnomah County Library, surrounded by windows that let in the spring light Margaret had learned to appreciate again. What I want you to understand, Margaret told the assembled group, is that the confusion you're feeling, the guilt, the anger, the sense that you should have seen it coming, is normal. When someone we trust betrays us this completely, it shakes our ability to trust our own judgment. An elderly man named Robert raised his hand. His daughter had convinced him to sign over power of attorney, then systematically drained his retirement accounts. How do you learn to trust again? Anyone. Margaret considered the question that had haunted her own recovery. I think trust becomes more discerning. I still trust people, but I verify. I pay attention to actions, not just words. And I trust myself to protect myself, which is something I didn't do before. After the meeting, Margaret walked to her car alongside Elena, who had become her co-facilitator and closest friend. Their relationship had evolved into something deeper than friendship, a chosen family bond that filled spaces in Margaret's life that blood relatives had vacated. Good session today, Elena said. Robert seemed to find some peace with your answer about trust. I hope so. It took me months to understand that protecting myself didn't make me cynical. It made me wise. They drove to the Oregon State Penitentiary, where Margaret made her monthly visit to see David. These visits had become rituals of careful honesty, conversations bounded by love but tempered by reality. David looked healthier than he had in years. Prison had given him structure, sobriety, and time to confront the addiction that had driven his desperation. His letters over the past months had shown genuine introspection rather than manipulation. How's the support group going? David asked after they'd settled in the visiting room. Growing. We have 25 families now. The prosecutor's office refers people to us when they're dealing with financial elder abuse cases. David nodded, unable to meet her eyes completely. I think about them sometimes. The other families. How what I did to you probably made it harder for them to trust their own children. Margaret studied her son's face, seeing genuine remorse rather than the self-serving regret she'd recognized before. David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. He looked up, wariness flickering in his eyes. When you get out in 6 months, what do you want from me? David was quiet for a long moment. I want to earn back some small piece of your trust. Not the old kind. I know that's gone forever. But maybe just enough that you don't have to worry about me anymore. And if that takes years? Or if it never happens? Then I'll have to live with that, David said quietly. Mom, I destroyed something precious, and I know I might not be able to rebuild it. But I want to try, if you'll let me. Margaret reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. I'm willing to let you try. But there will be boundaries, David. Legal boundaries, financial boundaries, emotional boundaries. I understand. And I'm different now. I'm not the mother who enabled your problems because I was afraid of losing you. I already lost you, and I survived it. So if you want a relationship with me, it has to be based on who we really are, not who we wish we could be. On the drive home, Margaret reflected on how much had changed in the year since her nightmare began. She was teaching again, part-time consulting work with the district attorney's office, training law enforcement to recognize signs of elder abuse. She'd testified before the state legislature about the need for stronger protections for vulnerable adults. Her house felt different, too. She'd redecorated David's old room, turning it into a home office where she wrote articles about financial exploitation and medical abuse. The room that had once held reminders of the son she'd raised now held evidence of the work she was doing to protect other people's parents. Elena was waiting in Margaret's kitchen when she returned, preparing dinner as had become their comfortable routine. How was the visit? Elena asked. Hopeful, cautiously hopeful. Margaret hung up her coat and joined Elena at the stove. He's different, but so am I. I think we might be able to build something new. And if you can't, then I have this. Margaret gestured around her kitchen, where she and Elena shared meals and conversations, where she planned support group meetings and wrote articles that might help other families. I have work that matters, friends who care about me, and a life that's entirely my own. That evening, Margaret sat in her garden reading a letter from Patricia Blackwood. Dr. Walsh's conviction had set a legal precedent that was already being used in other medical abuse cases across the state. 3 other physicians had been investigated, after families recognized similar patterns to what Margaret had documented. The roses James had planted were blooming in their fullest glory, and Margaret found herself thinking not about what she'd lost. The naive trust, the son she'd thought she knew, but about what she'd gained. She'd discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She'd learned the difference between love and enabling. She'd found purpose in helping others navigate similar betrayals. Margaret pulled out her phone and, for the first time in months, composed a text message to David. Your letter this week showed real growth. I'm proud of the work you're doing on yourself. Keep going. She sent it before she could second-guess herself. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it wasn't a return to their old relationship, but it was acknowledgement of his efforts, of their continuing connection, of the possibility that something new might grow where something old had been destroyed. The fog that had once clouded her judgment, both chemically induced and emotionally chosen, had lifted completely. What remained was clarity about who she was, what she would and wouldn't accept, and how much control she had over her own life. Margaret Harrison had lost her mind, quite literally, for several terrifying weeks. But in fighting to reclaim it, she discovered that her mind was sharper, her boundaries clearer, and her life more authentically her own than it had ever been before. Sometimes the greatest gifts came wrapped in the most devastating packages. Sometimes, losing everything you thought you wanted revealed everything you actually needed. Margaret closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of James's roses, feeling at peace with the woman she'd become and the life she'd chosen to build from the ashes of her old assumptions about family, trust, and love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.